Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we are stepping away from the bright, hurried world of the present and retreating into the quiet, velvet-lined shadows of the 19th century. We are venturing into a time when death was not a sudden departure to a sterile hospital, but a deeply personal, meticulously choreographed guest in the home. Tonight, we unravel the daily rituals of the Victorian funeral director, the silent guardian of the threshold between the living and the dead. As always, let me know where in the world you are listening from tonight. Settle into your blankets, let your breathing slow, and let the modern world fade into the mist. Imagine, if you will, a cobblestone street in London. Perhaps in the year 1875, the fog is thick, clinging to the gas lamps like a damp shroud. The air carries the scent of coal, smoke, and rain. But inside one particular house, the atmosphere has shifted. The air is heavy with a different kind of stillness. In the Victorian era, the moment a soul departed, the house itself began to change. It was a transformation of light and reflection. One by one, the heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight, hooting the windows so the sun could no longer enter. The neighbors, seeing the darkened glass, would lower their voices as they passed. Inside, a strange and ancient superstition took hold: the mirrors. Every silvered surface, from the grand pier glass in the drawing room to the small hand mirror on the vanity, was draped in heavy black crepe. It was believed that the soul, in its first confused moments of liberation, might catch its own reflection and become trapped within the glass, unable to cross the final veil. Then there was the silence. The master of the house would move through the hallways, his footsteps muffled by thick carpets, to find every clock in the home. With a steady hand, he would reach out and stop the pendulum. Time was frozen at the exact moment the heart ceased its labor. In this house, time no longer existed for the living. It belonged entirely to the one who had left. And then a sound. Not a loud sound, but a rhythmic, deliberate one. The heavy iron knocker on the front door, striking once, twice. Through the fog comes a man dressed entirely in black. His frock coat is long. His top hat is draped in a silken weeper of black fabric, and his face is a mask of professional solemnity. This is the undertaker. He does not arrive with the frantic energy of a healer, for his work begins where the doctor's ends. He is the architect of woe, the conductor of the final performance. When he enters the hallway, he brings with him the scent of cedarwood and dried lilies. He speaks in a low, resonant tone of voice, trained to soothe the grieving while commanding the household. He is not merely a businessman. He is a master of etiquette in a society that obsessed over the good death. To the Victorians, dying well was an art form, and the funeral director was the lead artist. He would climb the stairs to the death room, where the air was kept cool and the scent of lavender was used to mask the first faint hints of decay. The Victorian funeral director viewed the body not as a medical specimen, but as the centerpiece of a sacred tableau. His first task was the laying out. This was often done with the help of local women nurses or watching women, but under his strict supervision. The eyes were closed, often held shut by the weight of 2 heavy copper pennies, ensuring the dead man's stare did not frighten the grieving. The jaw was bound with a silk ribbon to keep the features composed in a look of eternal peace. As the funeral director moved through these initial preparations, his mind was already calculating the complex geometry of social standing. Every fold of fabric, every piece of black-edged stationery, and every yard of crepe spoke a language. To the Victorian mind, grief was not just a feeling. It was a visible, measurable status. The funeral director was the one who ensured that the family's sorrow was displayed with the correct degree of luxury and decorum. He would sit with the widow in the darkened parlor, the only light coming from a single flickering candle. There they would discuss the order of the day. Would there be mutes standing at the door? How many horses? Would the plumes be black, or, in the case of a child, a heartbreaking, snowy white? These were not just choices of vanity. They were the rituals that anchored a family in a time of sea-tossing grief. The undertaker's hands, often gloved in black kidskin, were never idle. Even as he spoke, he was measuring the room for the trestles, measuring the hallway for the passage of the casket, and measuring the family's expectations. He was the weaver of the final veil. As the night deepened and the city outside grew quiet, the funeral director remained, a silent shadow working by candlelight to ensure that the transition from the world of the living to the world of the ancestors was seamless, dignified, and perfectly, hauntingly beautiful. In these first hours, the house felt like a cathedral. The ticking of the clocks had vanished, replaced by the soft rustle of black silk and the low murmur of the undertaker's instructions. The world of the Victorian funeral director was one of absolute precision. He knew that in the face of the great unknown, human beings crave order. He provided that order through the ritual of the shroud, the scent of the herbs, and the steady, unwavering presence of a man who was not afraid of the dark. Close your eyes now and imagine the flickering shadows on the wallpaper of that Victorian room. Feel the coolness of the air and the absolute stillness of the draped mirrors. The journey has only just begun. The body is prepared, the house is hushed, and the great machinery of Victorian mourning is beginning to turn, slow and heavy as the wheels of a black carriage on a rain-slicked street. Step away from the somber quiet of the Victorian house of mourning, with its draped mirrors and drawn curtains. Follow me back through the swirling evening mist to a place of industry and craft. This isn't a place of sorrow, but one of meticulous creation. This is the undertaker's workshop. The air here isn't thick with the scent of funeral lilies, but with the sharp, clean aroma of freshly sawn elm and the metallic temps of molten lead. In the Victorian era, a coffin was far more than just a box. It was the final statement of a person's life, a piece of bespoke furniture for the hereafter. The undertaker wasn't just a tradesman. He was an artist, a master of wood, fabric, and brass. The construction of a coffin was a sacred craft, a blend of high-end carpentry and solemn fashion. As the gaslights flicker, we see the craftsmen at work, their movements deliberate and respectful. The first choice, and perhaps the most important, was the wood. For the poor, simple pine, stained to look like something more, would have to do. But for the growing middle and upper classes, only the finest hardwoods were acceptable. Elm was a popular choice, known for its resistance to water and its beautiful, swirling grain that seemed to echo the complexity of a human life. Oak symbolized strength and tradition, while dark, lustrous mahogany was reserved for those who had commanded the greatest respect in life. Let's look closer at the masterpiece of Victorian funeral engineering, the triple-shell coffin. It was a marvel of layered construction, designed to preserve the dignity of the departed for as long as possible. The innermost shell was a soft, fragrant lining of white silk or quilted satin, padded with wood wool or fine hay. It was designed to look like a bed for an eternal, dreamless sleep. But this soft interior was encased in something much sterner, a shell of solid lead. The undertaker's assistants would meticulously solder the lead seams shut. This was a silent, intense process, done with focused precision. The lead served two crucial purposes. First, it was a barrier against the effluvia of decay, very real and present fear in the crowded, disease-ridden streets of Victorian London. Second, it added an immense, grounding weight to the coffin, making it a truly permanent vessel, an anchor against the shifting sands of time. Finally, the outer shell of polished wood was lowered over the lead, hiding the cold, functional metal beneath a facade of domestic elegance. Now, listen closely. Can you hear it? That rhythmic tap, tap, tap. That's the sound of small hammers affixing the coffin furniture. This was the Victorian term for the handles, plates, and decorative studs that adorned the exterior. These weren't cheap, mass-produced items. They were cast iron, brass, or even silver for the wealthiest clients. The most important piece of furniture was the breastplate. This was a shield-shaped piece of metal fixed to the lid, where an engraver would painstakingly etch the name of the deceased, their age, and the date they entered into rest. The level of detail was incredible. The undertaker was also a master of upholstering the dead. He would wrap the exterior of the casket in rolls of heavy black, velvet, or what was called superfine cloth. This fabric was secured with rows of shining brass upholstery nails, creating a tufted, luxurious appearance that mirrored the fine furniture you'd find in a wealthy Victorian drawing room. To look at one of these coffins wasn't to see an object of death, but a final, exquisite piece of cabinetry. And over in the corner, away from the sawdust, sit the seamstresses. Their needles fly through the dark fabric, sewing the shroud or winding sheet. In the early Victorian years, old laws required the dead to be buried in wool to support the domestic wool trade. But as the era progressed, the undertaker offered an entire wardrobe for the grave. A gentleman might be interred in his finest Sunday suit, his hands folded over a prayer book. A young woman might be dressed in a gown of pure white silk, her hair arranged just so. The undertaker oversaw every single stitch. He knew that when the family came for the private viewing, every detail had to be perfect. The lace collar had to be straight, the silk ribbon tied perfectly. He understood that these small, tangible details were all the living had left to hold on to. He wasn't just building a coffin, he was crafting a final, lasting memory for the survivors. As the night wears on, the coffin furniture is polished until it glows in the candlelight. The velvet is brushed free of any stray threads. The undertaker stands back, his shadow long against the brick wall, and inspects the finished work. There's no morbid pride in his gaze, only a deep, professional satisfaction. He has created a sanctuary. He has transformed the terrifying reality of the grave into a dignified, upholstered transition. This workshop is a place where raw materials, timber from the forest, metal from the mine, silk from the loom are transformed into a vessel for the spirit. It's a quiet, industrious bridge between the home of the living and the city of the dead. Feel the coolness of the polished wood. Hear the soft rustle of the velvet. The work here is nearly done. The casket stands ready, its brass handles gleaming, waiting to be transported back to the house where the clocks have stopped. Soon, the undertaker will prepare his horses, the great black Frisians with their flowing manes, for the journey back through the fog. The air in the workshop cools as the furnace dies down, silence returns, but it's a productive silence. The architect of grief has finished his work. Soon the procession will begin. 6 strong men will lift the heavy weight of the triple-shell coffin, and the long, slow walk to the cemetery will commence. But for now, in this quiet workshop, we can appreciate the craft, the care, and the incredible detail that went into saying a final Victorian farewell. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the past. If you found this glimpse into the Undertaker's world fascinating, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories from the shadows of history. See you next time. The workshop has grown cold. The craftsmanship of the elm and the velvet is complete. Now, we return to the street, where the private grief of a single Victorian family is about to become a public spectacle of monumental proportions. In the 1800s, a funeral was not merely a departure. It was a parade, a theatrical production designed to broadcast the status, piety, and profound sorrow of the bereaved to every passerby. This was the pageantry of woe, and its director was the man in the tall black hat, standing now at the head of a team of midnight black horses. Imagine the morning of the interment. Fog clings to the iron railings, but the street is waking in a hush. Neighbors have drawn their curtains halfway as a mark of respect, a silent bow from one house to another. At the door of the mourning house, 2 figures stand as still as statues. These are the mutes. Mutes were professional mourners hired by the funeral director to provide a visual anchor for the house's sorrow. Dressed in long black frock coats and top hats draped in nearly 2 yards of silken crepe. They carried long staves bound in black fabric. They did not speak, they did not smile, they barely seemed to breathe. Their presence served as a sentinel, guarding the threshold between the domestic world and the journey to the grave. To us, they might seem eerie, but to the Victorian, they were a comforter, physical manifestation of the gravity of the occasion. Then the sound of hooves begins, a slow, rhythmic clatter on the cobblestones. The funeral carriage, the hearse, approaches. In the Victorian era, the hearse was a masterpiece of macabre elegance. It was a glass-walled palace on wheels, often carved from solid ebony or stained oak, with ornate pillars shaped like weeping willows or inverted torches, symbolizing a life extinguished. Through the glass, the polished casket with its brass furniture was visible to all, draped in a pall of heavy black velvet. But the true stars of this procession were the horses. The Victorian funeral director spared no expense in sourcing the finest black Dutch Friesian. These horses were bred for their stature, steady temperament, and coats the color of polished obsidian. On this day, they are transformed. Great plumes of dyed ostrich feathers, black for an adult, white for the young, are fastened to their heads, nodding with every heavy step. They wear housing of black velvet that hangs almost to their fetlocks, embroidered with the family's crest or symbols of mortality. As the casket is brought out by the bearer's 6 men, chosen for their height and strength, the funeral director takes his place. He does not sit on the carriage. He walks. He leads the procession on foot, his silver-tipped cane striking the stones with a deliberate, grounding thud. Behind him comes the featherman, carrying a tray of black plumes upon his head, a strange and fluttering addition to the line. Now, imagine the mourning coaches following behind. These were closed carriages, their interiors lined in black cloth, carrying the family. The order of these carriages was a matter of intense social hierarchy. The closest male relatives came first. Women were often discouraged from attending the graveside, staying home in their darkened parlors to pray. Though this changed as the century progressed. The coaches moved at a funeral pace, a slow, agonizingly deliberate crawl. To hurry a funeral was a scandal. It suggested the living were eager to return to their business, that their love was fleeting. The procession winds through the narrow city streets. As it passes, men on the sidewalk remove their hats, costermongers silence their cries. The bustling commerce of London bows its head for a moment as the pageantry of woe passes by. The funeral director watches the crowd with a keen eye, ensuring the family's dignity is maintained, that no horse stumbles, and that the weepers on the mourners' hats flow gracefully. There is a specific vocabulary to this movement: the rustle of silk mourning cloaks, the creak of the leather harness, the smell of damp earth rising from the park. The Victorian funeral was designed to be felt in the bones. It was an acknowledgement that death is heavy. For these 2 hours, life does not go on. It pauses, it reflects, and it honors. Within the mourning coaches, the air is still and hot. The mourners are encased in crepe-hard, scratchy silk, treated to have a dull, non-reflective finish. To wear shiny silk was a sin of vanity. The bereaved must be as matte and light-absorbing as the soot on a chimney. The funeral director provided these weepers and mourning hatbands, ensuring every guest was uniform in their desolation. As the procession nears the gates of the Great Garden Cemetery, perhaps Highgate or Kensal Green, the atmosphere shifts again. We leave the gray, soot-stained streets of the living and enter the city of the dead. The iron gates groan open, and the horses' hooves transition from the hard clatter of stone to the soft, respectful crunch of gravel. Here, the funeral director's role becomes even more precise. He must navigate the labyrinth of monuments, weeping angels, and crumbling urns to find the exact plot. He has already sent gravediggers ahead to open the earth, a task performed with surgical neatness, the edges of the grave lined with evergreen boughs or black cloth to hide the raw dirt. The Victorians hated the sight of undressed earth. Even the hole in the ground had to be upholstered. As the featherman lowers his tray and the mutes take their final positions at the corners of the plot, the funeral director steps to the edge. He checks the lowering straps, strong hemp ropes that must hold the half-done weight of the triple-shell casket. There is a moment of profound tension as the casket is poised over the abyss. The ostrich plumes on the horses' heads flutter one last time in the cemetery breeze. The funeral director looks to the clergyman, nodding silently. The service is about to begin, but the pageantry of woe has already done its work. It has elevated a private loss into a communal myth. It has used black horses, silent mutes, and velvet plumes to build a bridge of beauty over the terrifying gap of the grave. Feel the stillness of the cemetery air, the way the sound of the city seems to die away behind the high stone walls. The procession has reached its destination. The long, slow walk is over. But for the funeral director, the ritual is not yet finished. There is still the earth to earth, the final closing of the veil, and the long journey back to a house that must eventually learn to tick again. Here, the gravel crunching under the wheels of the retreating coaches. The plumes are still. The mutes have vanished like ghosts into the mist, and the heavy scent of evergreen boughs fills your senses. We are standing at the very edge of the Victorian soul, where the public show of the street meets the private silence of the earth. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more dives into history's fascinating corners. The procession has halted at the cemetery gates, but the work of the Victorian funeral director extends far beyond the graveyard's edge. While he is the architect of the event itself, he is also the enforcer of a complex, visual language that the living must speak for months and, often years after, the last clod of earth has fallen. This is the world of mourning etiquette, a rigid social code where every thread of fabric and every glimmer of jewelry told a story of exactly how much time had passed since a heart last beat. In the Victorian era, grief was not something you simply felt. It was something you wore. It was a uniform, as disciplined as a soldier's, and the funeral director was the quartermaster. He worked closely with mourning warehouses, vast, somber department stores like the famous J.S. of Regent Street, to ensure that a family was correctly desolate. To fail at mourning dress was not just a fashion faux pas, it was a moral failing, a sign of disrespect that could see a person shunned from polite society. At the center of this ritual was the widow. For her, the language of crepe was a sentence of 2 years. For the first year and a day, she entered the period of deep mourning, or full mourning. Imagine her in a dress of solid black, but not the shimmering black of silk, or the soft black of velvet. She was draped in hard crepe, a scratchy, crimped silk that had been treated with shellac to remove all its natural luster. The Victorians believed that in the first year of grief, a woman should be a black hole in the room, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. The crepe was heavy and stifling, often emitting a faint chemical odor. It was a physical weight, a constant, tactile reminder of her loss. Her face was hidden behind a weeping veil of the same light-shunning fabric, reaching sometimes to her knees. When she walked through the park, she was a moving shadow, a ghost among the living. The funeral director ensured that this veil was of the highest quality, for even in the depths of despair, the quality of one's crepe signaled one's place in the world. As we linger in this quiet, fabric-filled room, notice the transition that occurs as the months crawl by. After the first year, the widow moved into slight mourning. The heavy, scratchy crepe was slowly discarded, replaced by Parramatta silk or plain black bombazine. The veil was shortened, then pinned back. This was the first thaw of the mourning cycle. Finally, in the last 6 months, she entered half mourning. This was a delicate, twilight period. The solid black was finally broken, but not by the bright colors of the meadow. Instead, she was permitted the mourning colors: lavender, lilac, mauve, and a soft, misty gray. To see a woman in a lavender ribbon was to know, without a word being spoken, that she was 18 months into her journey, and that the world of the living was slowly calling her back. But the language of mourning was not written in fabric alone. It was etched in stone, in coal, and most poignantly, in human hair. Look closely at the jewelry worn by the mourners. In an age before digital photographs, how did one keep the physical essence of the departed near? The answer was memento mori. Remember, you must die. The most popular material for mourning jewelry was jet, found in the cliffs of Whitby. Jet is fossilized collancient, lightweight, and capable of being carved into intricate, matte black designs of weeping willows, urns, and broken columns. It was Queen Victoria's favorite, and where the Queen went, the empire followed. However, there was something even more intimate: hair jewelry. The funeral director often acted as the intermediary, carefully clipping a lock of hair from the deceased before the casket was sealed. This hair was not merely kept in a locket, it was woven, Specialist hair workmen would take these strands and, with the precision of a lace-maker, weave them into intricate chains, brooches, or even three-dimensional floral wreaths. A widow might wear a bracelet made from her husband's hair, the clasp made of gold and black enamel, engraved with the words "not lost, but gone before." It was a way of keeping the dead tethered to the skin of the living. It was tactile, intimate, and to the Victorian mind, deeply romantic. It turned the biological remains of a loved one into a work of art that could be worn to church, a constant, silent conversation between the two worlds. The funeral director also managed the stationery of sorrow. Every letter sent from a house in mourning had to be edged in black. The width of the black border, the mourning band, corresponded to the depth of the grief. In the first weeks, the border might be half an inch wide, leaving only a small square of white for the actual message. As the months passed, the border would shrink, millimeter by millimeter, a visual countdown to the end of the formal grieving period. Even the sealing wax used to close the envelopes was black, rather than the traditional red. To walk into a Victorian study during this time was to see a world defined by these borders. The calling cards left in the silver tray by the door, the prayer books, the handkerchiefs, all of them, carried the black mark. It was a way of signaling to any visitor exactly what level of conversation was appropriate. You did not tell a joke to a woman with a half-inch border on her handkerchief. The funeral director provided these supplies, acting as a consultant on the geography of the page. Even the children were not exempt from this visual language. While infants were often kept in white symbolizing purity, older children were placed in muted tones of gray or brown, with black armbands or ribbons. The entire household, including the servants, became a living extension of the funeral director's aesthetic. The footman might be given new liveries of deep black, and the lady's maid would find herself sewing black glass beads onto every garment in the wardrobe. This obsession with the language of crepe and coal served a vital psychological purpose. In the modern world, we often expect the grieving to get over it quickly, to return to normal life in a matter of weeks. The Victorians, guided by their funeral directors, allowed no such rush. By mandating a 2-year visual journey, they gave the bereaved a shield. The black dress said, "I am not myself. I am wounded. Be gentle with me." It was a slow, external peeling away of sorrow, layer by layer, until the person inside was ready to face the sun again. As you drift deeper into sleep, imagine the quiet sound of a pen scratching across black-edged paper. Imagine the cool, smooth touch of a jet brooch carved into the shape of an anchor, the symbol of hope. The Victorian world was a place where nothing was left to chance, and even the clothes on one's back were a bridge to the silent world of the ancestors. The funeral director has done his job well. He has provided the tools for the long vigil. He has turned the raw, jagged edges of death into the soft, manageable curves of silk and lavender. The house remains quiet, the clocks are still stopped, but in the language of the fabrics and the stones, the story of a life is being told and retold, until the black turns to gray, and the gray finally mercifully turns back to the colors of the morning. The house is shrouded, the procession has passed, and the language of crepe has been established. Now we follow the Victorian funeral director to the final destination, the place where his meticulous planning meets the eternal silence of the earth. We enter the city of the dead. In the early years of the 19th century, the dead of London were buried in tiny, overcrowded parish churchyards. These spaces were so packed that the ground literally rose above the level of the street, and the air was thick with the miasma of decay. But the Victorians, with their love for grandeur and their burgeoning knowledge of sanitation, revolutionized the graveyard. They created the Magnificent Seven, a ring of vast, park-like cemeteries surrounding the city, designed to be both a sanitary necessity and a place of sublime beauty. As we pass through the towering iron gates of a place like Highgate or Kensal Green, the sounds of the living world, the clatter of the omnibuses, the cries of the street vendors begin to fade. The funeral director steps off the carriage, his boots crunching on gravel paths that wind like serpents through a lush, curated wilderness. This is not a place of horror, but a garden of sleep. The Victorian cemetery was a mirror of the Victorian city, just as there were grand squares for the wealthy and cramped alleys for the poor. The city of the dead had its own prestigious neighborhoods. The funeral director acted as a high-stakes real estate agent for the afterlife. He would guide the family in choosing a plot, perhaps a prime location on a hillside with a view of the chapel, or a prestigious spot along the main avenue where the passing mourners could admire the family's monument. And, oh, the monuments. To the Victorian mind, a gravestone was a final opportunity to speak, a sermon in stone that would last for centuries. As you walk through the long grass, in your mind's eye, look at the symbols carved into the white marble and gray granite. The funeral director knew the secret vocabulary of every chisel mark. An anchor was not for a sailor, but a symbol of hope and a soul firmly moored in faith. A broken column did not mean the mason had failed. It represented a life cut short, a pillar of the family fallen before its time. You might see a draped urn, the stone cloth carved so delicately it seems to flutter in the breeze. This represented the veil between the two worlds. Or perhaps a sleeping lamb, carved in pure white Carrara marble, marking the resting place of a child. The most prestigious families, however, did not settle for a mere headstone. They commissioned mausoleums, miniature stone houses for the dead, complete with iron doors and stained glass windows. The funeral director held the keys to these silent mansions. He would ensure that the interior was swept, that the stone shelves, the loculi, were ready to receive the heavy leaden caskets, and that the air inside remained as still as a bated breath. But beneath the beauty of the weeping angels and the ivy-covered crosses lay a darker, more industrial side of the Victorian death trade, the catacombs. If the family chose, the funeral director would lead the bearers down a flight of stone stairs, deep into the earth. Here, in the cool subterranean dark, the air smells of damp stone and old incense. The catacombs were long galleries, lined with thousands of bins or recesses. In the flickering light of the undertaker's lantern, you would see rows upon rows of velvet-covered coffins, stacked like books in a library of the departed. The funeral director had to be a master of ventilation and chemistry in these depths. He ensured that each coffin was sealed with that thick lining of lead we saw in the workshop. For in the confined air of the catacombs, the effluvia of the dead could become a literal poison. He moved through these halls with a professional's ease, a shadow among shadows, checking the seals and the nameplates, ensuring that even in the deep earth the social order was maintained. As the afternoon sun begins to dip below the horizon, casting long skeletal shadows across the Celtic crosses, the funeral director prepares for the final act of the day, the committal. The family gathers around the open grave. In the Victorian era, the undressed earth was considered vulgar. To shield the grieving from the harsh reality of the soil, the funeral director would line the grave with evergreen boughs, U or IV, to create a green room for the casket. Sometimes he would even drape the raw earth in black velvet. As the clergyman speaks the words, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, the funeral director produces a small silver or wooden box. Inside is not common garden dirt, but finely sifted, dry earth or even flower petals. He hands this to the chief mourner, who lets it fall with a soft, ghostly hush onto the lid of the casket far below. It is the sound of a final door closing. The Victorian funeral director understood that the cemetery was a place of competitive mourning. As he walked back toward the gates, he would pass the graves of those who had no one to remember them, the pauper espits, and compare them to the towering obelisks of his clients. He took pride in the height of the stone and the thickness of the ivy. He had helped his client achieve immortality through architecture. The city of the dead is now silent. The horses wait at the gate, their ostrich plumes damp with the evening dew. The funeral director takes one last look over the landscape of stone and shadow. He has seen the body into the earth, the soul into the chapel, and the family into their long vigil. As you fall deeper into sleep, imagine the moonlight hitting the wings of a marble angel. The city of London glows in the distance, a hive of light and noise. But here, in the garden of sleep, everything is perfectly, eternally still. The gravel paths are empty. The iron doors of the catacombs are locked. The funeral director's day is ending, and the long, slow dream of the Victorian era continues under the watchful eyes of the stone sentinels. The heavy iron gates of the cemetery have grown shut, and the crunch of gravel beneath the carriage wheels signals the end of the outdoor drama. But as the funeral director leads the mourning coaches back through the darkening streets of the city, the ritual is far from over. In the Victorian world, the journey to the grave was always followed by a return to the table. This was the feast of grief, a complex and vital hospitality that the funeral director managed with the same precision he applied to the depth of a grave or the quality of a shroud. As the carriages pull up to the house where the clocks are still frozen, the atmosphere begins to shift. The intense public silence of the cemetery gives way to the muffled, domestic industry of the funeral tea. The Victorian funeral director knew that grief was a physically exhausting labor. The mourners, encased in their heavy crepe and stifled by the cold air of the vaults, returned home with a hollow ache that required more than just prayer to fill. Step inside the parlor as the guests remove their black gloves and unpin their heavy veils. The funeral director has coordinated with the household staff to ensure that the transition from the city of the dead to the dining table is seamless. The table is a sea of white linen and polished silver, but it is punctuated by the visual markers of the occasion. There are no bright centerpiece flowers. Instead, there might be sprigs of rosemary for remembrance or small bouquets of dried lavender. The centerpiece of this hospitality was the funeral biscuit. These were not the sweet, buttery confections of a summer garden party. A Victorian funeral biscuit was a solemn, symbolic object, often made of a dry, sponge-like dough flavored with caraway seeds, an ancient herb associated with warding off evil spirits. Each biscuit was individually wrapped in high-quality white paper, but it was the wrapping that truly mattered. The funeral director ensured that each paper was sealed with black wax and printed with a memento mori poem or a woodcut illustration of a weeping willow, a skull, or a winged hourglass. These biscuits were often handed to the guests as they arrived back at the house, a tactile token of the day's sorrow. Some guests would not even eat them. They would take them home to keep in a tin or a drawer, a stale, sugary ghost of the event, preserved for years as a souvenir of the departed. In the more rural parts of the country, or among those who clung to the old, darker ways, the funeral director might still encounter the senator, while the practice was fading by the high Victorian era. Its echoes remained in the way food was handled in the presence of the dead. Traditionally, a loaf of bread and a bowl of ale would be passed over the casket. The senator, a man usually shunned by the village, would consume the food, and in doing so, eat the sins of the deceased, allowing their soul to pass unburdened into the next world. The Victorian funeral director, ever the modern professional, frowned upon such superstitions. Yet he understood the underlying human need to incorporate the act of eating into the act of letting go. As you listen to the low murmur of voices in the parlor, imagine the morning wine, port, sherry, and dark ales were served in abundance. It was said that the wine helped settle the nerves of those who had seen a loved one lowered into the leaden depths of the catacombs. The funeral director would often have a glass himself, standing discreetly in the hallway or the kitchen, ever watchful, ensuring that the hospitality did not veer into unseemly revelry. He was the guardian of the tearful decorum. There was also the arvel bread, a heavy, spiced loaf distributed to the poor of the parish on the day of the funeral. The funeral director saw this as a final act of charity on behalf of the deceased, a way to ensure that the community, even those who did not know the family, would speak the name of the departed with a full stomach and a thankful heart. The food served at the funeral tea followed a strict social hierarchy, much like the morning dress. For the wealthy, there were cold meats, elaborate jellies, and tiered stands of sandwiches. For the working class, it was a knife and fork tea, a substantial meal of ham, pickles, and bread, often the most expensive meal the family would provide in a decade. The funeral director helped the family navigate these costs. He knew that for many, the feast of grief was a crushing financial burden, yet one they would bear gladly to avoid the shame of a shabby send-off. As the evening wears on, the candles in the parlor begin to burn low. The tea has been poured, the biscuits have been pocketed, and the initial shock of the burial has settled into a weary, heavy-lidded exhaustion. The funeral director prepares to depart. His work in this house is almost complete. He has moved the family from the suddenness of the death room, through the pageantry of the streets, into the silence of the cemetery, and finally back to the restorative ritual of the hearth. Before he leaves, he often performs one final, quiet duty. He presents the memorial cards. These were small, intricately laser-cut cards using the technology of the day that featured lace-like borders and the details of the deceased's life and death. They were the Victorian version of a digital tribute, something to be tucked into a prayer book or framed on a mantelpiece. The funeral director had spent hours with the printers, ensuring the gold leaf was centered and the verse was appropriately pious. The feast of grief served as the bridge. It allowed the living to talk about the dead in the past tense for the first time. Over the clink of teacups and the rustle of black silk, stories were told. The terrifying cold reality of the grave was pushed back by the warmth of the fire and the communal act of eating. The funeral director, standing by the door, with his top hat in hand, would observe this softening of the atmosphere with a quiet, professional nod. He would then step back out into the London night. The fog has returned, thicker now, tasting of soot and salt. Behind him, the house is no longer a tomb. It is a home in mourning, a different thing entirely. The clocks will soon be wound again. The mirrors will be undraped, though perhaps not for several more days. The language of crepe will continue, but the pageantry of woe has concluded its final act. As you drift toward a deeper sleep, imagine the taste of a caraway biscuit and the warmth of a fire in a darkened room. Feel the weight of the day lifting, replaced by a heavy, peaceful fatigue. The Victorian funeral director has closed the books. He walks toward his own home, his footsteps echoing on the damp stones. A man who spends his life in the service of the great silence, ensuring that even in death, there is a place for the living to gather, to eat, and to remember. The embers in the grate are glowing a soft, dull red. The shadows on the wall are long and still. The city of the dead is far away now, and the feast is over. Let the rhythm of the horse's hooves fade in your mind, and let the quiet velvet night take hold. As the echoes of the feast of grief fade into the quietude of the night, we turn our attention back to a peculiar and haunting fixture of the Victorian streetscape. We have seen them standing like ebony statues at the threshold of the mourning house, and we have seen them pacing with rhythmic solemnity at the head of the procession. These are the mutes. To understand the Victorian funeral director's daily labor is to understand the management of these professional shadows, the men whose job it was to embody a sorrow they did not personally feel. The profession of the mute is perhaps the most striking example of the Victorian desire to outsource the decorum of death. The funeral director did not just provide a casket, he provided a cast of characters. The mute was a specialist in the theater of silence. Their training was rigorous in its own quiet way. They were taught the undertaker's stance, shoulders back, chin slightly lowered, eyes fixed on a point exactly 6 feet ahead. They were the physical borders of the event, defining the space where the sacred met the mundane. Imagine being a man in London in 1880, seeking employment with a prominent funeral director. You would not be judged on your strength or your carpentry skills, but on your face. A successful mute required a countenance of stone. The funeral director looked for men with long, somber featuresmen who could remain motionless for 4, 5, or 6 hours at a time, regardless of the biting wind or the driving sleet of a London winter. These men were the human equivalent of the black crepe draped over the mirrors. They were there to absorb the light and the noise of the world. The funeral director acted as the master of the mutes, a director of a silent play. Before a funeral began, he would inspect his troupe. He would check that their weepers, those long flowing bands of silk attached to their top hats, were ironed and hung to the exact required length. He would ensure their gloves were pristine and that their staves, wrapped in black fabric, were held at the precise angle of 45 degrees. There was a geometry to this grief, and any deviation was a mark of unprofessionalism. The mutes were often criticized by the more cynical observers of the era, such as Charles Dickens, who saw them as a morbid absurdity. Yet, for the Victorian family, they served a vital psychological purpose. Death is chaotic. It is messy and unpredictable. The mute was the opposite. He was ordered, predictable, and utterly still. By placing these silent sentinels at the door, The funeral director signaled that the home had been removed from the normal flow of time. Within those walls, the mute was the guardian of the family's privacy. But what of the life of the mute when the veil was lifted? These men were often casual laborers, recruited from the docks or the warehouses for a day's wage. Underneath the fine black frock coat provided by the funeral director, a mute might be wearing the threadbare rags of the extreme poor. The funeral director's workshop often doubled as a dressing room, where these men would undergo a transformation. They would step in as laborers and step out as gentlemen of the shadow. There was a dark irony in their work. After the burial was complete and the family had retreated to their feast, the mutes were often seen at the local public house, still dressed in their mourning finery, drinking gin or ale to warm their chilled bones. The funeral director had to manage this carefully. A drunken mute was a scandal that could ruin a firm's reputation. Thus, the master of the mutes often maintained a strict code of the pint, ensuring that his men did not break their professional mask until they were far from the eyes of the grieving. The funeral director also employed feathermen and bearers. While the mutes were the stationary art of the funeral, the bearers were its muscle. They had to be of uniform height, usually 6 feet, to ensure that the casket remained perfectly level as it was carried up narrow Victorian staircases and down the slippery paths of the cemetery. The funeral director would drill these men in the slow step, a synchronized walk that minimized the swaying of the heavy, lined casket. To watch them was to watch a slow-motion dance, a testament to the funeral director's obsessive control over every movement. In this chapter of our journey, let yourself feel the strange, cold stillness of the mute's life. Imagine standing on a London sidewalk, the fog swirling around your ankles, your breath visible in the air, yet you must not move, you must not speak. You are a living monument to a stranger's loss. You hear the crying of the children inside the house. You hear the heavy thud of the casket being moved. You hear the horses stamping their feet in the street. You are the witness who does not testify. The funeral director valued his mutes because they provided value for woe. In a society where everything from the size of your house to the number of buttons on your coat was a status symbol, the number of mutes at your door was a clear indicator of your wealth. A first-class funeral might feature 4 or 6 mutes. A shabby genteel affair might have only 2. The funeral director was the arbiter of this economy of sorrow, balancing the family's budget against their need for public dignity. As the sun sets on our 7th chapter, the mutes are packing away their staves. The silken weepers are being folded back into cedar chests in the undertaker's back room. The men are returning to their own lives, shedding the black coats and the stony faces. But for the duration of the day, they were the anchors of the Victorian imagination. They were the ones who stood at the edge of the abyss and refused to blink. The master of the mutes closes the ledger for the day. He knows that tomorrow there will be another house, another door, and another need for the silent men in black. The ritual relies on this artifice, this beautiful, somber lie that grief can be captured and held still by a man in a tall hat. Feel the deep, rhythmic calm of that silence now. The world of the Victorian funeral director is a world of layers: the wood, the lead, the velvet, and finally, the silent men who stand guard over it all. Let the image of the motionless mute fade into the darkness of your mind. The street is empty. The door is closed. The silence is no longer a performance. It is simply the night. The velvet curtains of the Victorian parlour have been drawn, and the silent mutes have retreated into the fog. But behind the scenes, in the cool, dimly lit recesses of the funeral director's sanitary room, a different kind of ritual was beginning to take shape. As the 19th century progressed, the Victorian obsession with order and science began to clash with the ancient, untidy reality of biological decay. This tension gave birth to a new role for the funeral director. He became a chemist of the afterlife. Tonight, we explore the chemistry of the grave, the innovations, the fears, and the meticulous preservation techniques that transformed the Victorian funeral director into a pioneer of the modern mortuary. In the early decades of the Victorian era, the primary goal was containment. As we discussed, the triple-shell coffin, with its heavy lead lining, was designed to keep the air of the living separate from the gases of the dead. But for the Victorian elite, simply containing decay was not enough. They desired a life in death, a way to keep the features of their loved ones frozen in a state of serene slumber for as long as possible. They feared the corruptive influence of the city's damp earth, and they feared, perhaps more than anything else, the loss of the physical likeness. This desire led to the rise of modern embalming. In the mid-1800s, the funeral director's workshop began to smell less of sawdust and more of pungent chemicals. Early experiments involved the use of zinc, chloride, arsenic, and eventually the revolutionary discovery of formaldehyde. The funeral director would become an artist of the vein and artery. With the precision of a surgeon and the eye of a painter, he would replace the fleeting fluids of life with the enduring liquids of the laboratory. Imagine the funeral director working by the light of a single, brilliant gas mantle. He is dressed in an apron of heavy rubber, a new material of the industrial age. His tools are made of polished steel and ivory. He moves with a quiet, practiced grace, knowing that his work will determine whether a family can keep their private viewing open for 3 days or 10. He was fighting a war against time, using the weapons of the burgeoning chemical age to win a small, temporary victory for the grieving. But this chemistry was not just about preservation. It was about hygienic peace. The Victorians were terrified of the miasma, the idea that the scent of death could carry disease through the air. The funeral director was the frontline soldier against this invisible enemy. He used deodorizing powders made of charcoal and lime, and he filled the casket with aromatic herbs, not just for their symbolic meaning, but to serve as a chemical barrier. The scent of a Victorian funeral was a complex bouquet, the sweetness of the lilies, the medicinal sharp of the formaldehyde, and the earthy, grounding scent of the cedarwood shavings. However, as the funeral director mastered the chemistry of the body, a new and darker fear began to haunt the Victorian imagination, the fear of premature burial. The 19th century was filled with Gothic tales of the apparent dead waking up inside their lead-lined shells. This was the age of Poe, a time when the line between a deep coma and the final breath seemed terrifyingly thin. To combat this, the funeral director became a purveyor of safety coffins. These were marvels of Victorian mechanical ingenuity. Some were equipped with air pipes that led to the surface, capped with a delicate silver whistle. Others featured a cord tied to the hand of the deceased, connected to a bell mounted on a headstone. The funeral director would carefully thread the silk cord through the layers of velvet and lead, ensuring that if the departed were to move even a finger, the bell would ring through the silent cemetery, summoning the night watchman. As you lie there, listen to the imaginary sound of that bell, a faint, silver tinkle in the graveyard wind. It was a comfort to the living, a chemical and mechanical assurance that the funeral director had accounted for every possibility. He was the one who verified the signs of life using the mirror test against the lips or the needle test in the skin, acting as a final judge before the lid was screwed down with those heavy, ornamental brass bolts. This era also saw the rise of thanatopraxy, the art of restoring the appearance of the dead. If a death had been long and grueling, the funeral director would use waxes and cosmetics to reconstruct the face of health. He would tint the cheeks with a faint rose hue and use cotton wool to fill the hollows of the eyes. He was creating a tableau vivant, a living picture. The goal was for the mourner to look into the casket and say, "They look as if they are only sleeping." This phrase, so common today, was a hard-won victory of the Victorian funeral director's chemical craft. The sanitary room was a place where science met the sacred. Here, the funeral director handled the most intimate and difficult realities of our existence with a professional detachment that bordered on the priestly. He saw the body not as a source of dread, but as a vessel to be cared for, cleaned, and preserved with the utmost dignity. He was the one who bathed the limbs in rosewater and combed the hair for the final time, ensuring that the last memory the family held would be one of stillness and grace, not of the ravages of time. As the night deepens, imagine the rows of amber bottles on the undertaker's shelf, gleaming in the low light. The heavy, protective rubber apron is hung up. The steel instruments are cleaned and laid in their velvet-lined cases. The chemistry of the grave has been applied. The body is now prepared, a word the Victorians loved for its suggestion of a journey about to begin. The fear of the air, the fear of the earth, and the fear of the waking all have been managed by the man in the black coat. He has used the inventions of his age to create a cocoon of safety around the departed. The lead is sealed, the formaldehyde is at work, and the bell on the grave remains silent. Close your eyes and feel the absolute security of this Victorian order. Everything has its place. Every fear has a remedy. Every biological truth has been softened by a chemical grace. The funeral director has mastered the elements, and now he leaves the rest to the long, slow passage of the years. The city of the dead is a place of chemistry now, a place where the wood and the metal and the spirit are held in a delicate scientific balance. The lamps are being extinguished in the workshop. The scent of lavender and charcoal lingers in the cool air. You are safe, you are watched over, and you are part of a history that cared deeply for the dignity of the end. The chemistry has been settled and the body preserved, but now we must pull back the velvet curtain to reveal the gears of the great Victorian engine that powered it all. The mourning trade. To the Victorian funeral director, death was not only a sacred rite, it was a sprawling, highly specialized industry. In a society where the Industrial Revolution had made everything a commodity, even sorrow was for sale. Tonight, we explore the death shops, the staggering costs of decorum, and the desperate, quiet struggle of the poor to secure a proper funeral. Imagine walking down a bustling London high street in 1885, nestled between the bakeries and the haberdashers. You would find the mourning warehouses. These were the cathedrals of commerce for the bereaved, the most famous being Jay's of Regent Street, known throughout the empire as the London General Mourning Warehouse. When a death occurred, the funeral director often acted as a guide, leading the family into these hushed, black-draped halls. As you step inside in your mind, notice the atmosphere. The floor is covered in thick, sound-absorbing carpets. The assistants move like shadows, their voices never rising above a whisper. There are no bright colors here. Instead, the shop is divided into departments based on the depth of one's grief. There is the casket department, the jet jewelry gallery, and the crepe room. The funeral director would assist the widow as she navigated the mourning scales. Every item had a price, and every price signaled a social standing. A Victorian funeral was a massive financial undertaking. For a middle-class family, a respectable funeral, including the lead-lined coffin, the 2 mutes, the 4 horses with plumes. But the funeral director was more than a salesman. He was a social strategist. He understood the shame of the shabby. In the Victorian era, the worst fate a family could suffer was not death itself, but the pauper's grave, to be buried by the parish in a nameless pit with no ceremony and no stone, was a stain that could haunt a family's reputation for generations. Because of this, the mourning trade extended down to the very poorest streets. Even the lowliest chimney sweep or factory hand would pay a few pennies a week into a burial club or a friendly society. These were early forms of insurance, managed by the funeral director or the local pub, designed to ensure that when the end came, there would at least be a decent shroud and a ride to the cemetery. The funeral director often worked with these clubs, providing Class 4 or Class 5 funerals, modest affairs with a plain elm coffin and a single horse butt, funerals that nonetheless maintained the dignity of the departed. The cost of mourning was not just in the burial, but in the dressing. The funeral director oversaw the distribution of mourning clothes to the entire household. It was common for a wealthy family to provide black suits and dresses, not just for themselves, but for their servants, their coachmen, and even distant cousins. This gift of black was a significant part of the mourning trade's revenue. To look upon a household in full mourning was to see a massive investment in fabric miles of silk, wool, and the dreaded, expensive crepe. As you listen to the distant chime of the shop bell in the fog, consider the second-hand mourning trade. For those who could not afford J's of Regent Street, there were smaller shops in the East End that sold refurbished black clothing. Because mourning periods were so long and death so frequent, there was a constant supply of black garments being bought, sold, and dyed. The funeral director often knew where to send a family of modest means to find a gently used veil or a reblocked top hat, ensuring they could still play their part in the public pageant of woe. There was also the trade in memorialia. The funeral director's office was often a gallery of the macabre and the beautiful. He sold death masks, plaster casts taken of the deceased's face within hours of their passing, allowing the family to keep a 3-dimensional likeness on their library shelves. He sold post-mortem photography, a booming business where the deceased was posed, often with eyes painted onto their closed lids or propped up by hidden iron stands, to look as though they were merely daydreaming with their living relatives. To us, these items might seem haunting, but to the Victorian customer, they were precious anchors. In an age of high mortality, these objects were the only way to stop time. The funeral director was the merchant of these memories, the man who provided the physical evidence that a person had existed, had been loved, and had been sent away with the proper expensive honors. But why the expense? Why did the Victorians bankrupt themselves for a single day of theater? The funeral director understood the answer. The funeral was for the living. In a rigid class system, the funeral was the final audit of a person's life. It was a statement to the neighbors, the creditors, and the community. "We are still here," the black plumes said. "We are still respectable," the light-lined casket declared. As the night grows deeper, imagine the funeral director sitting in his small office at the back of the warehouse. He is working by the light of a single candle, tallying the ledgers. He counts the yards of ribbon, the number of gloves distributed, the cost of the Arvel bread. He is a businessman, yes, but he is also a witness to the profound sacrifices people make for the sake of love and reputation. He sees the widow handing over her last gold sovereigns to ensure her husband has the extra ostrich plumes on his hearse. He sees the pride and the pain intertwined in the exchange of coin for crepe. The mourning trade was a cycle that never stopped. As soon as one family moved from full mourning to half mourning, another family would be walking through the doors of the warehouse, their eyes red, their voices trembling, ready to begin the long, expensive journey. The funeral director was there for all of them, the steady hand at the center of the storm of commerce and grief. Feel the weight of all that fabric, the heavy bolts of velvet, the stiff rolls of crepe piled high in the darkened warehouse. The shop is locked now. The street is quiet. The commerce of sorrow has paused for the night, but the ledgers remain open, waiting for the first knock on the door at dawn. You are safe in the stillness, away from the costs and the pressures of the world. Let the image of the silent, black-draped shop fade. The trade is done. The rest is silence. Have you ever wondered what it was like to say goodbye to a loved one in the Victorian era? It wasn't just a quick funeral and a somber gathering. It was a deeply elaborate, multi-day affair, steeped in tradition, superstition, and a unique way of processing grief. Today, we're pulling back the black mourning veil to explore the fascinating world of the Victorian funeral vigil. When someone passed away in the Victorian era, time seemed to slow down. Before the rise of professional funeral homes, the family home became the central stage for the entire mourning process. The first and most critical task was preparing the body for the vigil, also known as the wake. This wasn't a job for strangers. It was an intimate act performed by family members, usually the women of the household. They would gently wash and dress the deceased, often in their finest clothes or a special burial shroud. This final act of care was a way to honor the person and ensure they were presented with dignity. Once prepared, the body was laid out in the best room of the house, typically the parlor. This room was transformed into a sanctuary of mourning. All the mirrors in the house were immediately covered with black cloth. This wasn't just for decoration. The Victorians had a deep-seated fear that if a mirror reflected the deceased, their spirit could become trapped inside. Another belief was that anyone who saw their own reflection in a mirror in the death room would be the next to die. Superstition was woven into the very fabric of their grieving rituals. The windows were shuttered, and heavy black drapes were hung, plunging the house into a state of perpetual twilight. Clocks were stopped at the exact time of death, a symbolic gesture to show that for the grieving family, time itself had ceased to move forward. Flowers, especially those with strong, pleasant scents, like lilies and roses, were placed around the casket. This served a dual purpose. They were a symbol of life's fleeting beauty, but they also had a very practical function to help mask any unpleasant odors. As the body lay in state, especially in the days before modern embalming was common, the vigil itself would begin. For several days and nights, family, friends, and neighbors would come to the house to pay their respects. The core principle of the vigil was that the deceased should never be left alone. A constant watch was kept over the body, around the clock. This practice, known as waking the dead, has ancient roots. One of the most common beliefs was that the vigil protected the soul of the departed from being snatched by evil spirits on its journey to the afterlife. It was a guard of honor, a final protective act for the person they loved. The atmosphere during these vigils could vary. At times, it was one of deep, silent reverence. Visitors would enter quietly, perhaps kneel beside the open casket to say a prayer, and offer quiet words of condolence to the family. But it wasn't always so somber. Vigils were also social gatherings. They were a time for the community to come together, support the bereaved, and share memories of the person who had passed. Food and drink were often served, and stories were told, some sad, some funny, all of them painting a picture of the life that was lived. It was a way of celebrating the individual while collectively mourning their loss. There was also a very practical, if somewhat morbid, reason for the constant watch. In an era of less than perfect medical science, tales of people being mistakenly pronounced dead and waking up in their own coffins were a genuine fear. The vigil served as a final check, a waiting period to ensure the person was truly gone before burial. It's a chilling thought, but it was a real concern for the Victorians. The dress code was incredibly strict. Mourners, especially the immediate family, were expected to wear black from head to toe. For women, this meant heavy, non-reflective fabrics like black crepe, complete with black bonnets and veils. The length and depth of mourning were rigidly dictated by one's relationship to the deceased. A widow, for instance, was expected to remain in full mourning for at least 2 years, a period of social seclusion where she wore only black and withdrew from society. It was a visible, public declaration of her grief. Specialized items, known as mourning paraphernalia, became a huge industry. There were black-edged stationery for writing letters, mourning jewelry made from jet, or even the hair of the deceased, and post-mortem photographs. Taking a photo of the deceased, often posed as if they were merely sleeping or even with living family members, might seem strange to us today. But for the Victorians, in an age when photography was new and expensive, this might be the only image they ever had of their loved one. It was a precious, tangible memento to hold on to. After 2 or 3 days, the vigil would come to an end. The morning of the funeral, the coffin would be closed for the last time. A procession would then form, often led by a horse-drawn hearse draped in black plumes. The number of horses and plumes was a status symbol, indicating the wealth and social standing of the family. The procession would slowly make its way from the home to the church, and then to the cemetery for the final burial. The entire community would often stop what they were doing, with men tipping their hats as the hearse passed, a final gesture of respect. Looking back at the Victorian funeral vigil, we see a world that was both familiar and strangely different. Their rituals were a complex blend of love, respect, deep-seated superstition, and social expectation. While our modern practices may be simpler and less governed by rigid rules, the core human need remains the same: to honor the dead, to comfort the living, and to find a way to navigate the profound experience of loss. The Victorians just did it with a bit more pomp, a lot more black crepe, and a watchful eye on the mirrors. Thanks for joining me on this journey back in time. If you found this glimpse into the past as fascinating as I do, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more explorations of history's most interesting traditions. See you next time. The vigil has ended, and the morning light has signaled the finality of the transition. The funeral director has turned the last brass screw, and the pageantry of woe has wound its way through the city to the gates of the garden cemetery. But for the elite of Victorian society, the simple grave the hole in the earth lined with evergreen. For them, the end of the journey lay beneath the stone, in the chilling, silent architecture of the family vault. Tonight, we follow the Victorian funeral director as he leads the way down into the subterranean world of the crypt. This is where the city of the dead becomes a literal city, with streets of stone and houses of iron hidden away from the sun and the rain. It is a place of absolute stillness, where the air is ancient and the only sound is the rhythmic drip of water against limestone. Imagine the funeral director standing at the entrance of a grand mausoleum. He holds a heavy iron key, intricately forged and cold to the touch. With a deliberate turn, the lock groans a sound that echoes through the quiet cemetery like a final sigh. The doors swing open, revealing a flight of stone steps disappearing into the gloom. The funeral director does not hesitate. He has walked these steps many times. He lights a torch or a high-powered oil lamp, and the shadows of the weeping angels above flee as the light touches the damp walls of the descent. As you follow him down in your mind, feel the temperature drop. The air becomes crisp, tasting of mineral and age. This is the subterranean drawing room. For the Victorians, the vault was an extension of the family estate. It was not a place of disposal, but a place of residence. The funeral director's task here was to ensure that the social order of the family was maintained, even in the dark. The vault is lined with loculi shelves, carved into the stone or brick, stacked from floor to ceiling. The funeral director moves his lamp across the rows, and the light glints off the tarnished brass plates of those who have gone before. Here lies the patriarch, his casket of heavy mahogany, now gray with a fine layer of dust. Beside him, the matriarch, her velvet covering now brittle and faded to a ghostly shade of charcoal. The funeral director treats these silent residents with the same respect as the living. He does not brush away the dust, for in the vault, dust is a mark of time's honorable passage. The bearers, 6 men of steady nerve and strong back, begin the descent. They are carrying the triple shell casket, the masterpiece of elm, lead, and velvet. In the narrow confines of the vault, their task is a grueling one. The casket weighs nearly half a ton. The funeral director stands at the base of the stairs, his voice a low, steadying anchor as he directs their movements. Easy now. To the left, steady. He is the conductor of this final, heavy dance. There is a specific etiquette to the placement of the casket. The funeral director ensures that the head is positioned toward the east, awaiting the dawn of the resurrection. He checks that the nameplate is perfectly horizontal, legible for any future descendant who might descend to pay their respects. Once the casket is slid into its niche, the funeral director performs a ritual unique to the vault. He inspects the seal, because these bodies are not buried in the earth. The lead lining we discussed in the workshop is the only barrier between the dead and the air. The funeral director looks for any signs of venting, a grim reality of the chemistry of the grave. If necessary, he has brought his soldering irons and his lead paste to ensure the seal remains perfect. He is the guardian of the vault's atmosphere, ensuring that the peace of the sanctuary is never broken by the untidiness of nature. In some grander vaults, the funeral director might oversee the immune. A mason is brought in to brick up the opening of the niche, covering it with a slab of polished white marble. The funeral director watches as the mortar is applied, ensuring the lines are clean and the stone is level. Upon this slab, the family's history is extended by another line of gold leaf lettering. As the bearers retreat up the stairs, leaving the funeral director alone for a final moment, the silence of the vault is absolute. It is a silence that feels heavy, like the weight of the earth above. The funeral director takes a moment to adjust the pall, the heavy cloth that might be left draped over the casketan, perhaps places a single sprig of dried rosemary on the stone ledge. He is the last person to see this face, the last to touch this vessel, before it is left to the centuries. He climbs the stairs, his lamplight receding, until the vault is once again plunged into a darkness so thick it feels like a physical presence. He steps out into the gray afternoon of the cemetery, pulls the iron doors shut, and turns the key. The journey to the vault is complete. The body is now entombed, a word that carries a weight of permanence that a simple burial does not. To the Victorian mind, the vault was the ultimate security. It protected the departed from the resurrection men grave robbers who had haunted the previous century, and it kept the family together, a silent reunion in the deep earth. The funeral director was the architect of this reunion, the man who held the map to this hidden genealogy. As you drift closer to sleep, imagine the cool, unchanging temperature of that stone chamber. While the seasons change above, while the snow falls on the headstones and the summer sun bakes the grass, the vault remains the same. It is a place beyond the weather, beyond the noise of the city, and beyond the reach of time. The funeral director has seen his client into their final home, and he carries the key back to his workshop where it will hang on a hook until the next member of the lineage is called to join the silent ranks. Feel the weight of the stone above you as a protective shield, a heavy blanket of history that keeps the world away. The air is still, the darkness is kind, and the journey is at an end. You are resting in the heart of the Victorian earth, where everything is ordered. Everything is silent, and everything is at peace. The iron key has turned in the lock of the vault, and the heavy thud of the cemetery gates has signaled the official end of the ceremony. But for the Victorian funeral director, the ritual does not end with the burial. As the sun rises on the first day after the interment, he returns to the mourning house. This is the time of the mourning, after a quiet, transitional period where the funeral director oversees the dismantling of the theater of woe and the slow, painful return of the living to the world of light. Tonight, we watch as the architect of grief becomes a restorer of order. The heavy atmosphere of the previous week is beginning to lift, replaced by a weary, hollow calm. The funeral director arrives early, his step lighter than it was during the procession, yet still hushed in respect for the fragile state of the household. His first task is the unveiling, one by one. The funeral director or his trusted assistants move through the rooms to remove the symbols of the death watch. The black crepe that has shrouded the mirrors for days is carefully untacked. As the fabric falls away, the silvered glass is revealed once more, blinking like an eye-opening after a long sleep. To the family, seeing their own reflections again can be a startling, grounding moment of physical reminder that they are still among the living. Then there are the windows, the heavy velvet blinds, which have been pulled tight against the sun, are finally raised. The funeral director watches as the pale morning light floods back into the hallways, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It is a moment of profound symbolism. The house of shadow is becoming a house of glass and light once more. The neighbors see the blinds go up and know that the first stage of the journey is over. But perhaps the most poignant ritual of this morning is the winding of the clocks. As we recall, time was frozen at the moment of death. The pendulums have been silent, the gears still for days. Now, the funeral director stands before the grand long case clock in the hall. He reaches in, his fingers finding the heavy brass key. With a steady, rhythmic crank, 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 he brings the mechanism back to life. He sets the hands to the current hour, and with a gentle nudge, the pendulum begins its familiar, comforting tick-tock. In the Victorian mind, this was the heartbeat of the house returning. The funeral director knew that this sound, so easily ignored in health, could be deafening in its return. It signaled that the period of frozen time had ended, and that the long 2-year march of the mourning calendar had begun. He performs this duty with a solemn grace, acknowledging that while time has started again for the family, it is a different kind of time than it was before. The funeral director then moves to the administration of memory. He sits with the master of the house, or the widow's solicitor, to finalize the ledgers. This is the quiet, practical side of the mourning trade. He presents the final accounts, the cost of the Arvel bread, the wages for the mutes, the fees for the cemetery sexton, and the bill for the triple shell casket. He also hands over the certificates of burial, those vital slips of paper that prove to the state and the church that the soul has been properly accounted for. During this meeting, he also presents the memorial proofs. These are the drafts for the permanent monument to be erected in the cemetery. They discuss the choice of stone-white Carrara, marble or somber gray granitand, the final wording of the epitaph. The funeral director is a master of chiseled elegance, suggesting verses from scripture or the poetry of Tennyson that will best capture the character of the departed. This conversation shifts the family's focus from the raw grief of the body to the enduring legacy of the stone. Outside the parlor, his assistants are busy clearing away the last of the pageantry of woe. The black plumes are being packed into their cedar boxes. The weepers are being folded. The trestles that held the casket are being loaded onto a plain cart. The funeral biscuits that remained uneaten are cleared away, and the black-edged stationery is organized into a writing desk. The funeral director ensures that nothing ghastly remains. He wants the house to feel sanitized, orderly, and ready for the long vigil of mourning that will take place within its walls. Before he departs for the final time, the funeral director often leaves a small gift, a consolation token. This might be a framed photograph of the floral tributes, or a small, leather-bound mourning journal, where the widow can record her thoughts during the coming months. He understands that while his role as the conductor is over, his role as a consultant of sorrow continues. He will return in 6 months to assist with the transition to half-mourning, and again in a year to oversee the cleaning of the monument. As the funeral director stands at the front door, his top hat in his hand, he looks back at the hallway. The clocks are ticking. The mirrors are bright. The sun is shining on the carpet. The house is no longer a tomb. It is a domestic space once again, albeit one marked by an invisible absence. He bows silently to the servants and steps out onto the street. The morning after is a quiet victory for the funeral director. He has successfully navigated the family through the most treacherous waters of their lives. He has provided a structure for their chaos and a beauty for their pain. As he walks back to his workshop, he passes the florist and the baker, the world moving on with its usual noisy indifference. But he carries with him the secret of the house he just left, the knowledge of the silence, the lead, and the velvet. Imagine the sound of that clock ticking in your mind. Tick, tock. It is a steady, hypnotic rhythm that leads you deeper into your own rest. The shadows of the mourning house have retreated to the corners. The world is bright, the work is done, and the order of the Victorian age remains unshaken. The funeral director has restored the house to the living, and now he goes to prepare for the next knock upon his door. Feel the peace of a house that has been tidied, the comfort of a routine restored. The morning is here, the vigil is over, and you are drifting on the steady current of time, safe, settled, and still. The iron key has turned in the lock of the vault, and the heavy thud of the cemetery gates has signaled the official end of the ceremony. But for the Victorian funeral director, the ritual does not end with the burial. As the sun rises on the first day after the interment, he returns to the mourning house. This is the time of the mourning, after a quiet, transitional period where the funeral director oversees the dismantling of the theater of woe and the slow, painful return of the living to the world of light. Tonight, we watch as the architect of grief becomes a restorer of order. The heavy atmosphere of the previous week is beginning to lift, replaced by a weary, hollow calm. The funeral director arrives early, his step lighter than it was during the procession, yet still hushed in respect for the fragile state of the household. His first task is the unveiling, one by one. The funeral director or his trusted assistants move through the rooms to remove the symbols of the death watch. The black crepe that has shrouded the mirrors for days is carefully untacked. As the fabric falls away, the silvered glass is revealed once more, blinking like an eye-opening after a long sleep. To the family, seeing their own reflections again can be a startling, grounding moment of physical reminder that they are still among the living. Then there are the windows, the heavy velvet blinds, which have been pulled tight against the sun, are finally raised. The funeral director watches as the pale morning light floods back into the hallways, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It is a moment of profound symbolism. The house of shadow is becoming a house of glass and light once more. The neighbors see the blinds go up and know that the first stage of the journey is over. But perhaps the most poignant ritual of this morning is the winding of the clocks. As we recall, time was frozen at the moment of death. The pendulums have been silent, the gears still for days. Now, the funeral director stands before the grand long case clock in the hall. He reaches in, his fingers finding the heavy brass key. With a steady, rhythmic crank, 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 he brings the mechanism back to life. He sets the hands to the current hour, and with a gentle nudge, the pendulum begins its familiar, comforting tick-tock. In the Victorian mind, this was the heartbeat of the house returning. The funeral director knew that this sound so easily ignored in health could be deafening in its return. It signaled that the period of frozen time had ended and that the long 2-year march of the mourning calendar had begun. He performs this duty with a solemn grace, acknowledging that while time has started again for the family, it is a different kind of time than it was before. The funeral director then moves to the administration of memory. He sits with the master of the house or the widow's solicitor to finalize the ledgers. This is the quiet, practical side of the mourning trade. He presents the final accounts, the cost of the Arvel bread, the wages for the mutes, the fees for the cemetery sexton, and the bill for the triple shell casket. He also hands over the certificates of burial, those vital slips of paper that prove to the state and the church that the soul has been properly accounted for. During this meeting, he also presents the memorial proofs. These are the drafts for the permanent monument to be erected in the cemetery. They discuss the choice of stone-white Carrara, marble or somber gray granitand, the final wording of the epitaph. The funeral director is a master of chiseled elegance, suggesting verses from Scripture or the poetry of Tennyson that will best capture the character of the departed. This conversation shifts the family's focus from the raw grief of the body to the enduring legacy of the stone. Outside the parlor, his assistants are busy clearing away the last of the pageantry of woe. The black plumes are being packed into their cedar boxes. The weepers are being folded. The trestles that held the casket are being loaded onto a plain cart. The funeral biscuits that remained uneaten are cleared away, and the black-edged stationery is organized into a writing desk. The funeral director ensures that nothing ghastly remains. He wants the house to feel sanitized, orderly, and ready for the long vigil of mourning that will take place within its walls. Before he departs for the final time, the funeral director often leaves a small gift, a consolation token. This might be a framed photograph of the floral tributes, or a small, leather-bound mourning journal, where the widow can record her thoughts during the coming months. He understands that while his role as the conductor is over, his role as a consultant of sorrow continues. He will return in 6 months to assist with the transition to half-mourning, and again in a year to oversee the cleaning of the monument. As the funeral director stands at the front door, his top hat in his hand, he looks back at the hallway. The clocks are ticking. The mirrors are bright. The sun is shining on the carpet. The house is no longer a tomb. It is a domestic space once again, albeit one marked by an invisible absence. He bows silently to the servants and steps out onto the street. The morning after is a quiet victory for the funeral director. He has successfully navigated the family through the most treacherous waters of their lives. He has provided a structure for their chaos and a beauty for their pain. As he walks back to his workshop, he passes the florist and the baker, the world moving on with its usual noisy indifference. But he carries with him the secret of the house he just left, the knowledge of the silence, the lead, and the velvet. Imagine the sound of that clock ticking in your mind. Tick, tock. It is a steady, hypnotic rhythm that leads you deeper into your own rest. The shadows of the mourning house have retreated to the corners. The world is bright, the work is done, and the order of the Victorian age remains unshaken. The funeral director has restored the house to the living, and now he goes to prepare for the next knock upon his door. Feel the peace of a house that has been tidied, the comfort of a routine restored. The morning is here, the vigil is over, and you are drifting on the steady current of time, safe, settled, and still.